see. So I want to thank Linda and the committee for inviting me to talk today, despite the somewhat controversial nature, I think, of this talk. So most of us have the same goal. That's to drive down smoking as quickly as possible and minimize the harms associated with current nicotine use. I actually think that although the U.S. has gotten a lot of things wrong related to alternative products, I think this quote from the Surgeon General in 2014 is actually quite accurate, in that he emphasizes the benefits of e-cigarettes and other innovations lie in their ability to rapidly reduce smoking and the use of combusted products. Indeed, throughout the conference, speakers have emphasized that it's not enough to simply make these alternative products available. For them to impact public health, they have to be appealing and actually reduce combusted product use. So this conference and the tobacco harm reduction movement in general largely focuses on the availability of these alternative products and how effective they are at reducing smoking. And their intent, which is to pull smokers away from combusted product use towards a less harmful product. And so to be clear, I fully support this effort. I think that tobacco harm reduction is an incredibly important tool in the battle against combusted product use. And I'm hopeful that it will achieve the shared goal of rapidly reducing smoking. However, what I want to talk about today is a potentially complementary approach. That is the approach to push people away from combusted products, and for those who prefer to use alternative products, and for those who don't prefer, to abstinence. And that there are different ways to push people. One would be taxes that might be differential taxes higher on the combusted product. However, the idea that I was asked to talk about today is reducing nicotine in the combusted product. And specifically, the idea that we might be able to set product standards for nicotine content in cigarettes and other combusted products that render them less addictive. So for the next few minutes, I want to make 3 points. So the first is that I want to talk about some of the data related to nicotine reduction. The data are clear and that they demonstrate that there's a reduction in smoking and a reduction in exposure to the byproducts of combustion when you reduce nicotine. The second point is that I have a concern that ANDs, although alternative nicotine delivery systems, although far less harmful than combusted products, might have a more limited public health impact than we all hope, or it may take many, many years for them to displace the combusted product on the marketplace. And the third is that I want to raise the possibility that policies that reduce the appeal and reinforcing effects of combusted products may accelerate that transition to harm-reducing products. And conversely, that the emergence of these harm-reducing products may enable a serious consideration of moving towards a market where reinforcing doses of nicotine are only available in non-combusted products. So in terms of the data related to nicotine reduction, what's shown here is one of the first studies I did. This is a little over 10 years ago. A study I conducted on an inpatient unit. So this is a unit that is much like a residential community and less like a hospital. And what we did is we had participants, smokers, stay on the unit for 11 days, and we randomized them to smoke one of two kinds of cigarettes. Cigarettes that had relatively normal nicotine yields and cigarettes that had dramatically reduced nicotine yields. And I'll note on this graph, I'm showing you the nicotine yields of the product. Later, I've switched to the nicotine content, the milligrams per gram of tobacco, because I think that's a better metric. So what you see here and what was striking to me are two things. One is that if you reduce the nicotine content of the cigarette and therefore reduce the yield, what you find is a reduction in the number of cigarettes smoked per day over the 11-day period, not the increase that many people might predict if they were concerned about compensatory smoking. The other thing that you see is that people still smoke these cigarettes. Nobody in this study just stopped spontaneously. They smoked at about half the rate by the end of the trial. These are data from Dorothy Hatsukami that followed up on that inpatient study a few years later on an outpatient basis where she randomized smokers, these were in this case smokers interested in quitting, to use nicotine-reduced products for a 6-week period prior to their quit attempt. Again, what I'm showing you here is cigarettes per day. And what you can see is that over that 6-week period, those individuals randomized to use the low nicotine yield cigarettes smoked fewer cigarettes, and by the end of the trial, about a 40% reduction in cigarettes per day compared to those randomized to smoke the control cigarettes. And these are data from the recent trial that we published a little over a year ago now, I guess almost 2 years ago now, of the largest study published to date on reduced nicotine products. In this study, what we did is we actually used a range of nicotine contents in the cigarettes. So this is a full dose response study where we wanted to know how low do you need to go to see this sort of effect. And these, again, are the cigarettes per day at baseline, and then for each of the 6 weeks post-randomization, this time in smokers who were not interested in quitting at enrollment. And what we found is that if you reduce the nicotine content of the cigarette to 2.4 milligrams per gram of tobacco or less, you see a reduction in smoking compared to the control groups and compared to a just moderate reduction of nicotine in the cigarettes to 5.2, suggesting that there's some threshold by which you could need to cross in order to see the potential benefits of reduced smoking, at least in terms of rates. So it looks like from these data that we don't see the increases that many people worry about related to nicotine reduction. If anything, we see decreases in cigarettes per day. But the other way that people can compensate is by changing the way they puff. So these are data related to the volume of puff drawn into the mouth as measured through a device that measures total puff volume. And if you were to see compensation, what you'd see is an increase in volume when you reduce the nicotine content of the cigarette. But in fact, what we see in these trials is, if anything, a decrease in the volume of puff, the puff volume over the cigarette. They inhale less smoke, not more, over the course of the trial and over the course of this individual cigarette. And in fact, that translates to reduction in some of the byproducts of combustion. Here I'm showing carbon monoxide. I've returned to that inpatient study because that inpatient study, we're certain they only were using the product we gave them, the low nicotine cigarettes. And in fact, I could measure carbon monoxide really well because they were in the unit all day long. So I took 3 measures at the same time every day, a highly controlled setting. And what you see is that when you reduce the nicotine content of the cigarette, you see a reduction, especially as the day goes on, in exposure to carbon monoxide that's consistent with the reduction in exposure in cigarettes per day. It shouldn't be surprising that they don't find these cigarettes all that satisfying. In fact, that's kind of the point. And so what we find is that smokers switch to reduced nicotine cigarettes will tell us that they taste a little different, that they don't find them as satisfying as their usual brand. Some of that is the fact that they've switched brands, because we have control cigarettes that can show that. About half the effect is just a brand switching effect. But some of the effect is the nicotine being removed itself. That is, it contributes to taste, it contributes to some of the reinforcing effects, and they can pick up on that even in a blinded study. And then it's not surprising that in the real world, when we send them out with these cigarettes in clinical trials, that not everybody is compliant. And in fact, relatively few are 100% compliant. We estimate that about 25% of our participants only use the low nicotine cigarettes we give them, and the rest supplement with something else. And we know this because we look at urinary nicotine metabolites. What we find is that most of the participants reduce their nicotine exposure substantially, and they're mostly compliant, but they supplement with an occasional usual brand cigarette that brings their nicotine levels a little bit up, but not up to baseline. And most of that non-compliance occurs at times where you might predict, like the first cigarette of the day. So their reduced exposure to nicotine, the decreases in satisfaction, the decrease in cigarettes per day, suggests that they might become less dependent if you reduce the nicotine content of the cigarette, and that is true, at least by the measures that we use. This is the FTND. Here I've removed cigarettes per day, which makes it an even more conservative estimate. And what you find is that in that clinical trial where they have the product for 6 weeks, relative to their baseline, there's a reduction in FTND scores by the end of the 6-week trial. That's not just true for the FTND, it's also true for other scales like the Wisdom, and it's also true for things like self-reported craving when they're abstinent. What was surprising to us, although in hindsight maybe it shouldn't have been given the dependence data, is that when we follow folks up at the end, 30 days after they complete the trial, so they're no longer using the product, and we ask them, we know you weren't interested in quitting at the start, but did you make a quit attempt in the last 30 days? Those who were randomized under double-blind conditions to the low nicotine cigarette were more likely to go ahead and make a quit attempt in the 30-day follow-up period. There's also data to suggest that use of these products reduces the likelihood of relapse, either when given as a pre-treatment prior to the quit attempt or as a relapse prevention or kind of rescue aid following the quit attempt. And I'm not going to go through all these studies, but I did want to provide you the references so you could look at those. So the data on nicotine reduction, I think, are pretty clear, and there's lots more that I'd be happy to talk about in the question and answer period. But what I want to move now towards is a recognition that, in fact, this is a highly intrusive policy, that there's no getting around that. It's a push policy, not a pull, and by definition, more intrusive. And so I think a critically important question is to ask whether it's necessary. If there are less intrusive policies or interventions that are adequate to rapidly reduce smoking, then those should take precedent over a more intrusive policy. So these are data that I think Deborah showed in the session yesterday on the use of electronic cigarettes in the UK from the ASH study that was just published. And there's a couple things I want to point out on this graph. So the first is that blue line, which is the percentage of smokers, current smokers who have tried e-cigarettes. It's up at about 60% currently, leaving about 40% of smokers who haven't even engaged with the product at this point, haven't tried it. And what's disturbing to me is that it's stalled, at least in the UK, it looks like, at around 60% over the last 3 years. The red line is the percentage of current smokers who are actually current vapers. And again, it's gone up to about 18% in the UK, but has been relatively stable over the last 3 to 4 years at that level. Okay, now there are some vapers that are not represented in this graph, those vapers who have quit smoking. And in fact, we now know that they have now outnumbered in the UK those who continue to smoke, which is great. But it leaves the vast majority of smokers unhelped by this tobacco harm, this harm-reducing product. That is, they either have not engaged with the product or they haven't continued to use it, and therefore it's unlikely to help them stop smoking. I think this is summed up nice by this quote from Deborah. It's excellent news that the number of vapers who have quit smoking is continuing to grow, but there are still 9 million smokers compared to only 1.5 million vapers who don't smoke at all. So why do so many people who have tried vaping stop? That's an incredibly important question, I think, that needs further consideration. And the top 2 reasons in the ASH survey that are listed here are that they didn't feel like a cigarette, like smoking a cigarette, and that the e-cigarette didn't help them deal with their cravings from smoking. And in fact, if we look at the satisfaction data, the top 2 bars represent those individuals who are current smokers, the vast majority of users, and the top bar being those who have given up vaping entirely, and the middle bar being those who are quote-unquote dual users. We find that the majority of users report that the e-cigarette is simply not as satisfying as a cigarette. 61% and 90% of those that have already given up on vaping, or at least so far. And in fact, those data are consistent with data from the US. These are data from Terry Pachasik, showing that level of dissatisfaction, or relative enjoyment, I should say, from e-cigarettes compared to cigarettes in those that have rejected e-cigarettes, tried it and abandoned use, those that are dual users, those again make up about 80% of this sample. And you can see that the vast majority say that the e-cigarette is simply not as enjoyable as their predicate product, the cigarette. So what's going to change that? We need to shift behavior, which means we need to shift preference. And so it may be that innovation will save that the progression of vaping devices might evolve to the point where they're more satisfying. And certainly we talk a lot about the potential for them to deliver better and better, more cigarette-like doses of nicotine. And these are just one set of PK data. There's lots of PK data available now. And I think we're getting really close to products that produce cigarette-like effects. So the question is, if you produce a cigarette-like PK profile, will that develop into an equally or more satisfying product? And I don't think the answer to that is clear, even under the best conditions. Part of the reason for that is because we know that if you give intravenous nicotine to smokers, it doesn't satisfy their craving. But if you let them smoke a cigarette that doesn't have much nicotine, it does. So those non-smoking aspects are a big determinant of craving independence. And I think reproducing the PK may not produce a more satisfying product. So then we can turn to other products that we think have the potential to produce some of the non-nicotine effects that might contribute to satisfaction, like the IQOS product and other heated products. And again, I think these hold promise, and I certainly hope that they are more competitive with the cigarette. This is a quote from Clive that I think really, who is actually the person who caused me to be on crutches, by the way. Sorry, I couldn't help that, Clive. Who actually thinks just summed up this issue quite well. Ex-e-cigarette users and current smokers find e-cigs unsatisfactory and say that something closer to smoking might work for them. That thing might be better nicotine delivery, or it might be something closer to smoking. I think the latter is at the heart of a huge bet that lies behind heat not burn. And I would emphasize the bet part. We are yet to know how effective these are as substitutes. So what I want to argue today or discuss a little bit is the issue that I think we face, which is the scale is tipped, and it's tipped in the wrong direction. It's tipped towards the combusted product. Now, the evolution of new products might tip that scale back, especially if we convey accurately the reduced harm. If those products get better at nicotine delivery, if there's a diversity of products, that might help tip the scale, or it might not for many smokers. But the other way to tip the scale is to remove some of the value of the combusted product, to make that a less appealing alternative, and to enable people to walk downhill towards the alternative products that would likely reduce their harm. These are data from Dorothy Hatsukami in a recent trial. I'm also getting told to wrap it up, and I'm almost there, in which she actually randomized people to smoke reduced nicotine or normal nicotine content cigarettes and gave them alternatives to use. And what she found was that if you gave people reduced nicotine cigarettes, you almost doubled the rate at which they tried those alternatives. Almost twice as many days they engaged with the alternative than if they still had the predicate product, the normal nicotine product. It was pushing people towards the alternative. It also reduced smoking, and the more they used the ANDs, the greater the reduction in smoking and the more days smoking abstinent. So this is the final slide. This is an editorial that Neil and I and Dorothy wrote talking about this potential complementary or even synergistic nature of this interaction that I think is certainly worth considering. I think there are issues related to nicotine reduction that are concerns that people have, things related to prohibition, things related to potential discomfort and dysfunction that are addressed by having alternative products and making that clear as a priority. And conversely, I think some of the limits of alternative products are addressed by the fact that if you reduce the abuse liability of combusted products, you're more likely to get people to use those alternatives and less likely to worry about things like the gateway, whether it's true or not. So for that, I want to thank you for your time.